Welcome to the Leadmore podcast. I'm your host, John T. Meyer. The Leadmore podcast is the show where we sit down with leaders of today to help inspire and create more leaders for tomorrow. Because I believe the world needs more leaders. And in this episode, this is one of those, I call it like a tactics episode. We hear from amazing leaders and learn their story, but we also need to know what are the tactics and the skills that a leader needs to add to their tool belt. And in this episode, we sit down with Adam Nathan, the CEO and founder of a company called Almanac. Almanac is working to help companies work more asynchronously, to help develop a writing culture in your company and allow you to work remotely and distributed in an effective way. So we start off the episode talking a little bit about what Almanac does, and Adam talks about that. But then we really dig into what does the future of remote work look like? Can you be a hybrid organization? Or should you choose either office or remote? And Adam feels pretty strongly about that. You'll hear his answer. And then lastly, how a leader needs to adapt and adjust for building a remote workforce and how to lead a more asynchronous team. So really fascinating stuff. I learned some lessons I'm going to apply to our team here at Lemonly, and I think you will too. So let's get to it. Adam Nathan. All right, welcome to another episode of the Leadmore podcast. I'm excited today to have the CEO and founder of Almanac, Mr. Adam Nathan. How are you doing, Adam?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, John.
Yeah, you bet. So this is perfect. I'm in South Dakota. You're in New York City, but you normally, I think, live in Florida. So this is like exactly on topic and on brand for what we're talking about today. Tell everybody what you do, Adam.
Yeah, I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Almanac. Almanac is an operating system for remote work and distributed teams. At its core, it's a real-time doc editor, but we built version control to keep closely related revisions and ideas organized so you don't have floating files, and asynchronous workflows to help automate the most common forms of collaboration so you can get feedback or approval or update documents without needing a meeting.
What was the word you used? Docketer?
Document editor. Yeah,
document editor. Okay. I was like, I've never heard that word. Okay, so help us understand. We have, people are probably familiar with, like, say, Google Docs. And then over here, we might have like a Notion or a Coda or some of these other kind of document tools. Where do you guys fall in that space?
Yeah, so you can use Almanac either for documentation, replacing things like Notion or Confluence, or for active collaboration, replacing Microsoft Word and Google Docs. It's a hybrid of the two, but at its core, it's most similar to Google Docs in that it's a real-time document editor that has all the basic creative options that you'd imagine in a document editor, but it also has cool modern composition features like command line, snippets, bidirectional mentions. And so it works a lot like how developers code. But what makes it unique versus, like, say, Notion for documentation is that in Almanac, when you publish documents to a handbook in read-only form, people in your organization can create what we call branches, which are temporary linked versions of that document to suggest changes. And so for documentation, Almanac takes your wiki and essentially turns it into a living handbook that anybody can suggest changes to from the bottom up, while giving you quality control over what actually gets merged in. And so certainly it's a kind of super powered collaborative tool designed for remote and asynchronous teams.
Cool. And is there a sweet spot of organization size or team, structure? How many locations that really thrive using Almanac? Like, if you're a 2-person company, do you have companies who do that?
Yeah, it's a great question. We see 3 types of teams really adopting Almanac right now. One are startups who want to make remote or distributed work a competitive advantage. And so that can be, 2 founders or teams of 5 to 10. But what Almanac helps those teams do is build a writing culture, a culture of documentation, a culture of no meetings from the start, so that as they scale, all of those ideas are just baked into the company's DNA. We also see Almanac being used heavily by remote organizations or distributed organizations. That's both like growth stage startups with hundreds of people who need to stay organized as they scale, but also political organizations, global nonprofits like the Red Cross, franchises, and other types of companies that were already working across time and space even before COVID. And the last teams we really see using it are technical teams. And so engineers, product managers, designers love our version control, our extreme transparency on who did what, where, and when. Almanac tracks basically every change you make to a document. You can see changes by comparing documents together. You can merge documents. And so all of those are great features for teams that have to collaborate on a lot of details and also make sure they don't make any mistakes in the process.
Sure. And I'd have to go back to my email and search, but it was either from you or maybe a sales team member. I remember got kind of like a beta invite to test it out. But the question I want to ask is, you guys were building this before a pandemic. And so tell us about how far you were in that journey. And I'm guessing how things have maybe exploded post-COVID.
Yeah. So we started Almanac about 2.5 years ago, and that was certainly before the pandemic came around and made every company a remote company. We just had an idea that work needed to change. I was a product manager before starting Almanac at lots of different companies, from Apple to Lyft to a fintech called Borrow. And I realized I was spending most of my days doing work that didn't feel like work, sitting in meetings nearly constantly, surreptitiously trying to respond to emails and Slack messages, which never seemed to end, having no time to actually do the things that I was supposed to do in my job description, the things that I was actually excited to do every morning. And so instead was doing work, at nights and on weekends, burning out pretty repetitively, and still never really knowing if I was actually doing a good job, like if I was moving things forward in the organization, around even basic tasks like, did the team sign off on this idea, or did my boss give me approval on this document? Very simple forms of collaboration like that ended up taking days and weeks, and of course thousands of Slack messages and emails and versions of documents. I had this contrast because I was a product manager with the engineers I was working with, who use a tool called GitHub. GitHub is a platform for asynchronous collaboration on code that allows engineers to basically compare their work to others, ask for feedback or approval as they try and combine their work together. And the engineers I worked with were both way more productive than I was at getting their stuff done every week, and also a lot happier. And so from the start, we started asking ourselves, why are developers living in this future, but the rest of us are stuck using tools that were designed for a type of work that happened entirely in an office and also in meetings. And so we saw basically a vision of the future through the way that engineers and now designers work in tools like GitHub and Figma. And that future came to everybody a lot faster than we expected, which has been really great for business.
Yeah. What are we talking about? How big has the team grown? I imagine the request or the awareness of asynchronous work has really exploded as well.
Yeah. We've been seeing, month over month growth, like at 200% plus for the past year or so. The team is still pretty small. It's about 25 people, but we'll be, I think, at 50 by the end of the year, and probably 100 or more by the middle of next year. And so, as we've gotten way more people using the platform, the types of requests and the needs of our customers have exponentially grown.
Perfect. Okay, so that's a great foundation. I want people to know, who you are, what you do, where Almanac lives in this space, and that's a good primer for where I want to go now, which is, if you are a leader, aspiring leader, the folks that listen to this show, what is asynchronous work? Why should I care about it? And how do I build that type of culture? So that's a lot. So let's just start with asynchronous work. What does it mean? Define that if someone's never heard that term.
Yeah, so I'll start first with the opposite, which is synchronous work. And so, as the name implies, synchronous work happens when collaboration or decisions get made at the same time in the same place. And so think about meetings are a classic form of synchronous work. The way that most people use Slack, which is to respond immediately, is another form of synchronous work. And so asynchronous work is the opposite of that, which is when collaboration and decisions and work can happen not at the same time and not in the same place. And so a classic example of asynchronous work is documenting things and then using, for example, Almanac's workflows to ask for feedback. And so you may not get feedback at precisely the same time you ask for it, but that enables people to collaborate and work together across time zones and geographies, which is essential for most hybrid, distributed, or remote teams these days.
Yeah, and it seems to me it creates more of an equitable type of work, or it allows you to step away from your computer or drop your son or daughter off at school, or even just if you live in a different time zone, you don't have to sync up with everybody else's part of the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So okay, so I think a good analogy I like to use is at Lemonly, we've been doing remote work since 2011. First employee was in Serbia. She worked here for 3.5 years and never physically met her. And so at that time, especially in South Dakota, that was pretty novel. And we've had employees all over the United States, Canada. But when the pandemic hit, I think we quickly realized that we were very remote friendly, but not very remote first, meaning we all had to experience what it was like to be that employee in Vancouver or Miami, and just be like, oh, it's kind of hard to hear on that call, or like there's a lot of side chatter, or like, what was the thing that I missed? Where's that document? And so talk about how do we make this transition now? We all went from just having to do it with a matter of weeks when the pandemic hit. I think now some organizations have kind of either given up and gone back. Some have really embraced it. Are there any like pro tips, I guess is what I'm asking, to make a more remote first workplace?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'd say is that I think there's no in between here. I think companies either have an office culture or they have a remote culture. And so a lot of companies that are, I think, trying to pursue hybrid, it's one thing to set a policy that says the days that people can be in the office versus not. But really, to hypothetically do hybrid well, you need to, as you just mentioned, erase the kind of second-class culture that exists for people who are not in the office. And in order to do that, you basically need to level the playing field so that even people who are in the office still functionally are remote or distributed, so that people who aren't in the office can participate in meetings, can contribute, can work to the same level of proficiency as those who are. And so what we've seen is that even companies that are trying to do hybrid, but that don't actually adapt that the way they work, the how of the work, still end up effectively with an office culture where there's people who can't be as productive or effective for the days that they're not there. And so that's not really a shift to the new way of working. It's just trying to like paint over it with a nice policy. And so we see companies that want to become remote or distributed really need to embrace changing the way that they work. And there's a couple of ideas or innovations that we've seen really work with the very best remote companies out there, companies like Buffer and GitLab. Those are companies that were doing remote before it was cool, before the pandemic. One innovation is, and it's pretty simple, is that you have to write everything down. You have to rely on documentation in order to create transparency, and you have to build a writing culture. Where rather than calling a meeting or slacking somebody, which is like a virtual shoulder tap, instead people explain their thinking and request tasks of others in documents instead. And that enables anybody to be able to, as you mentioned, equitably participate in that collaboration versus maybe being disadvantaged because they're not in the same time zone as the person who's making the request. And so one thing that all great remote cultures have is a culture of documentation. The second is a culture of asynchronous collaboration. If everyone's not in the same time zone, at Almanac, we have employees in 12 different time zones. It's almost impossible to be on a meeting with everybody at the same time. And as you mentioned, there's lots of really great benefits of remote work, including that you can hire great people wherever they live, and people can set their own hours and live the kind of life they want to. There's no reason to have 9 to 5. Because people aren't, different 9 to 5 anymore. Most people are doing creative and deeply intellectual work. But in order to enable people to work from anywhere at their own hours, you need to build a culture where people are able to make requests in written form. The expectation of a rapid response isn't there. But the benefits of async are that everything is written down. And so whether you come to the document, 2 minutes after the request is made or 2 years later, you're able to see who did what, how the document came to be, the record of collaboration via comments and tasks, who signed off when. And so, proper async actually enables people to have more ownership over their work, be much more productive with lower management. And so we think it's a step change in the productivity of the organization, as well as the satisfaction of employees, because people are a lot more free to do the work that they want to do without all the overhead of meetings and
exactly
and constant interruptions.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So I just want to ask you directly, because I feel like you're a great follow on Twitter at Adam P. Nathan. You talk a lot about remote work and asynchronous work. Because I have a guess where you might go with this. Do you believe you can do hybrid, or should it be one or the other?
No, I don't think hybrid's a thing.
Okay, that's what I thought you were going to say.
Yeah. And I think it's because there's a great thread that Steve Sinofsky had on Twitter about remote work as a form of disruption. And if anyone studied Clay Christensen's work on disruption, just disruptive changes come when there's a new technology that makes an industry or category like 10x better than the technology that existed before.
The emergence of the iPhone, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. And what tends to happen when there's a form of disruption is that the incumbents have no incentive to change, and they often can see the change coming, and they try and compromise or make a couple of small evolutionary changes, incremental changes on what they have. And so it's like Windows trying to adapt their desktop software for a phone, but not really designing it from the ground up for the mobile interface is a good example of this. And so, I think hybrid policies are basically the same thing, where companies are trying to basically preserve the old way of working with a couple of small changes. And because remote work is a disruptive force, it's essentially a technology of sorts, a technology around when and where and how we work, that you just can't impose the old way onto the new way. You mentioned a bunch of particular challenges with hybrid, which is unless you basically fundamentally overhaul the way that you work to become a remote organization, you have some people who can't participate when there's a whiteboard session going on in a conference room. They can't hear everybody equally. It's really awkward for them to try and participate in the conversation. They can't see everybody's facial reactions, which is a really important element of live collaboration. They have no idea what happens as people are walking out of the room or other conversations that are happening. And so it's you're essentially a second or third class citizen. And, I don't think we treat it's, I think, a form of disability in a sense where we don't treat people with physical or mental disabilities. Or we don't disadvantage them because they might be blind or they can't hear or they can't walk. But if you have a hybrid policy and you haven't actually changed your organization to be fully remote and how it works, then you're essentially tying your employees' hands behind their back in a meeting, or you're putting blinders over their eyes or mufflers on their ears because they are not on the same playing field as everybody who's in the office. So, I think the other opposite is true. Companies that have gone fully remote or can't go back into the office yet, but that are still trying to work via an office culture where there's nonstop Zoom meetings all day long, even more Slack messages and emails, have seen employees burn out en masse, resign a la the Great Resignation, create public petitions, trying to pressure their management teams to change. And it's a level of revolution that you haven't seen from the working professional class ever in the past 100 years. And so the opposite is true too. You can't do remote and you can't be fully remote and try and keep an office culture. I think you have to pick a lane. And we firmly believe that distributed culture, remote culture is going to win over office culture.
So I think to summarize that, I think it would be safe to say asynchronous work can live in both worlds, but it should either be fully distributed or an office culture, is what your thesis is.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's true. I mean, I think the choice is clear that remote culture is better. It's better for employees from the bottoms up. It gives a lot more freedom. It gives a lot more ownership, more flexibility. I also think it's great for management and for leaders. As you mentioned, you can hire people wherever great talent exists. You often can pay those people less because they're living in areas of lower cost of living, like South Dakota versus San Francisco. Sure. You can have an operation going essentially 24/7. Some people go to sleep and pick up and then the people who are waking up pick up their work and keep going. And so financially, equitably operationally, it's a far superior way of working to the like 9 to 5 factory style office that we kind of pulled from the World War II production method.
Yeah. And I'll be clear, I agree. I just wanted to kind of like put it out there as like a either or choice. And I'm curious then, because I know you've gotten this question, what's your response then to what about the culture or the water cooler conversation or that whiteboard session, right? Like Lemonly, we're a creative agency. So figuring out how to, brainstorm ideas. I like that point about a Slack being like a digital tap on the shoulder. What's your response to that question?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing I'd say is that async first or remote first doesn't mean async only. Remote first doesn't mean remote only either.
Can never see each other. Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's lots of times when having a meeting is the proper way to solve a problem or make a decision. So for certain types of brainstorming at Almanac, we use Zoom, but we use Miro for digital whiteboarding.
Sure. Yep.
And so there's lots of tools now beyond Almanac, which is focused on documents that allow you to essentially go async or at least be fully distributed for all different types of creative surfaces. I think to the question on culture, I don't personally believe that the 5 minutes you spent like gravitating around the water cooler or the times that you saw a piece of work on somebody's computer lead to more productivity or to better culture. On the productivity point, it's clear people are working more now in a fully distributed world than before, so much to the point that people need to stop working. Productivity is way up. And also to culture, most employees would rather take a pay cut than go back to the office, which speaks to an increased quality of life, especially between work and people's life outside of work. There are, good indications that the relationships people have with their colleagues help to improve retention. And so at Almanac, we do a couple things to mitigate this. One, we have an initiative, or we call it Almanac Community Dialogues, where we form small cohorts of employees to meet every 2 weeks to talk about deep topics outside of work. Things like, what does love mean to you? What's the purpose of life? How do you view friendship? How did you come to be? So that people actually get to know each other on a deep level. I think that's when people are saying work happy hours. For me personally, I have formed really deep relationships sometimes in the second or third or fourth hour of that happy hour, where you really get into it with somebody and form a relationship. And I think you can do that over Zoom as well, so long as you're being intentional. We also think at Almanac, it's critical to bring the team together to meet in person. There really is no substitute for getting to see somebody and understand their body language. And so we have both team and company-wide retreats 4 times a year. And if you think about how many of those work happy hours or events really were meaningful to you, I don't think it's more than maybe 3 to 6 times a year. And so I think for many companies, it's actually cheaper to bring people together for 3 to 6 times a year than it is to pay office rent with all of the extra costs associated with the physical space. And so it's still a really great deal because I think you can basically simulate for most of the stuff that you got in person, whether it's through digital things like Zoom initiatives or in-person retreats, and still end up saving money. Yeah,
that's great. So I think the last big one then is, if you're a leader who knows what the impetus point may be. It could have been the pandemic, or maybe now we're in the pandemic and your lease is expiring next year at the end of the year, or you're growing and you need to double your size. And you're thinking, which markets should we hire these people in? So you're starting to maybe weigh these factors of maybe choosing, the red pill or the blue pill, I guess, like if you're going to go fully distributed. What are the things you need to be thinking about as a leader, things you need to be prepared for, conversations you need to have? Like, what do you need to add to your tool belt to be a remote CEO or leader that you may not have had before?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, most of the people I talk to have already committed to remote or distributed work. I find it hard to even think of an argument to be in the office, except that maybe you are in a business where people need to be on-prem, or maybe you have a long-term lease and you're embedded somewhere. but I think one thing to think about is that there's a whole generation of workers that have now gone to school and gone to college in a remote context, and they are growing up in this world, and so that I think they're going to want this as they move into being professionals, and so this trend will only magnify over time. And as we've seen in the data, most people actually would prefer not to go into the office than go into the office because of the benefits that remote work give to individuals. So I think if you're a leader, the first thing I always say is that remote work and distributed work is not a matter of creating a policy. It requires you to re-examine how you're working. Because if you change the when and the where and the who, the how needs to shift too. If you don't change the how, then your people will burn out and they will quit. I'm not predicting that. That is a fact. It's not the data. So if you're a leader, you need to basically make a commitment to yourself, to your executive team, and to your organization that things are going to need to change. And building a great remote culture starts at the top that way. The second thing to do is build, I think, a set of carrots and sticks that enable your organization to help to change. On the carrot side, we've seen organizations do things like create meeting days, encourage their teams to block off time, provide language that help people say, do we really need a meeting for this? Can we do this over email or in a document instead? We at Almanac do something called Async Week, where we cancel all of our meetings and we turn off Slack for an entire week,
like that.
Which is extreme, but really helps. What we've seen happen after we do it is the volume of emails and Slacks and meetings, it goes back up after Async Week, but it doesn't go back to where it was. People are more used to working asynchronously. We've also seen customers do zero-based budgeting for meetings, where they'll cancel all the meetings on the calendar and have to re-put them back on just to get rid of any meetings that long lost their purpose, but people are still going to
just those recurring ones.
Exactly. So, I think those are a bunch of ways that leaders can incentivize their teams to rethink about their culture. A last point, which is beyond kind of process initiatives, is to set values that align with distributed and remote culture. I think a really big one is incentivizing results over hours. And that extends into performance reviews, into recognition that you do in your all hands meetings. At Almanac, we still think that for our business, we need people to work pretty hard. We're not the type of business where you can work 20 hours a week and change the world. But at the same time, we don't care so long as you're not disadvantaging your colleagues when you do your work, so long as you are accountable to the commitments you made to other people. And that's a really important part of getting people to move off of the idea that, like, so long as I put in my hours, I've done my job, to no, my job is to make this impact for the organization, to move the needle on these metrics. And the whole organization needs to evolve to that idea.
So we're talking about both the transition that, we're in this reframing and this mindset that I think is being accelerated, but also I loved your point about those younger talent, or the next generation coming up. Like, I think that's really, really astute to think this isn't just a blip on the radar. They will grow up in this world and expect that. So, we can, whether you debate on hybrid or not, but if you don't have any component of remote, I just really think you're disadvantaging, your potential team and outcomes and opportunities for a workforce. And, I haven't thought the next generation down to how the pandemic is going to change the future of work.
Yeah, I mean, I think about the innovations to come out of this disruptive shift around remote work, to include, as I mentioned, a culture of documentation for one, and asynchronous collaboration as a second. But a third is really around diverse teams. I think people who are Gen Z are used to diversity by default. It's obviously present in their media, it's present in their worlds, and even compared to me, who's a millennial, I think like Gen Z has grown up in a world where diversity is the default. And one of the things that remote work enables are truly diverse teams. If you have an office in San Francisco or in New York or in Dallas, you're probably going to find people in your company who look and act and think just like you. Maybe even went to the same schools or grew up in the same places, just based on how geography works. one of the benefits of remote work is you can hire people wherever they live. And beyond that, you can hire people based on what they can do versus just what's on their resume. And so, we at Almanac have people who didn't go to college working for us. We have people who have never worked in a high-tech company before, but who are as good or better as anyone I've worked with in Silicon Valley. And so when you're a distributed team, you get a much more diverse workforce, not just racially or via gender, but also ways of thinking, socioeconomic status, approach to life. And I think that's what a lot of the incoming class of professionals really expect.
Yeah, I love that. I don't even know your workforce or where they're at, but all I need to hear is 12 time zones. And I can assume that there's a lot of amazing advantages and just cool cultural differences when you say that. So, all right, cool. This is great, Adam. We'll finish with a little bit about you, a little rapid fire on kind of what makes you tick as a leader. I don't know if you're a big reader, but what's a book that you recommend most often?
A World Without Email by Cal Newport. I think it makes everyone in our company has to read it when they onboard, but it makes a really eloquent case for how the way that we were working before the pandemic has gotten really out of hand, and how tools like Slack and email have become overused for their initial purposes. And I think paints a really clear picture of the opportunity we have in front of us to reinvent how we work.
Interesting. I'll check that out. I love Deep Work from Cal Newport, but I haven't done that one.
Same thing.
How do you unplug during a pandemic, or what? How do you, when work life stressful, what do you do to unplug?
Yeah, the biggest thing for me is getting away from technology. And so I'm a big skier, surfer, biker, runner. And so whether it's just going for a run at night, even for me going to the gym during the weekdays, but in a bigger sense, spending the weekends hiking, or thanks to remote work, I spent the past winter living in Colorado skiing every day.
Cool.
That has really helped me create a sense of balance and perspective that there is a much bigger and more enjoyable, important world outside of my browser and computer screen.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What do you think your superpower is? The thing that you do best?
I think I'm pretty good at seeing around the corner and predicting what's going to happen. I've done it a couple of times in my career already, and I don't think everybody can.
In a broad macro sense, or
no, not necessarily what's happening like with my partner or friends. I wish I had that ability, but yeah, in a broad macro sense.
Cool. And so this is obviously, I mean, you made a bet on where work was headed, like I said, even before the pandemic, and I'm guessing that's one of these examples of that skill.
Yeah, I think the future never really turns out exactly how you expect it to in a precise way, but I think it generally heads in a certain direction, and I've been pretty accurate, if not precise. I couldn't have predicted that we'd have a pandemic, and that would be the thing that forces everyone to remote work. But it was pretty clear to me in Almanac's case that there was a better way of working that some people were already living in, and it was clear that everybody else, including me, was living in a way that was significantly worse. And so I didn't. It's been a great surprise that that future came a lot faster and more thoroughly than we expected. But we were always confident that there was going to be a better way that came about for people.
Cool. I like that. And the last question we always ask here at Leadmore are, who are the leaders who have inspired you, whether you know them or studied them?
That's a great question. I mean, I've been inspired by recently by, and this is a little lame, but Jeff Bezos and Reed Hastings. If there's been a bunch of books published recently about Netflix's culture, but the intentionality with which Reed Hastings thought about cultivating talent at Netflix, how they recruit people, how they reward people, with just tactical innovation at every level, including letting people take a really high buyout offer to leave the company if they weren't mission aligned, and basically proactively paying people more top of market so that people had no reason to take recruiter calls. I think aligns with how we build Almanac, which is to examine every part about how we work. And I think it's true of most high performance organizations. I think there's lots of amazing things about Amazon, but in particular, the way that they've intentionally approached meetings and building a culture of writing, even in a very big company with a lot of people who are working, who can't work remotely, is amazing. There's a bunch of rules Amazon has around writing a memo to start every meeting, giving people time to read the document and process it before the conversation starts. That aligned very well with asynchronous work. And so Amazon was doing this before the rest of us were pretty well. And I think a lot of that comes back to the vision of the founders of those companies.
Yeah, those are good examples. Yeah. Very like some of the best organizations in the world, but both of those examples can be applied to a 20-person company like Lemonly or a 25-person company like Almanac. So
totally.
That's great. Well, this has been fun. I'm excited to, re-listen to this and have other leaders embrace async and start to think about how they can, change their organizations in the future. If you have questions, how can someone get in touch with you or hear more of your thoughts?
Yeah, well, anyone who's interested in upgrading their tooling for remote work, go to almanac.io, and we have a 30-day free trial with special pricing right now as we're still in beta. And if you want to chat with me, feel free to DM me on Twitter. I think I'm at Adam P. Nathan.
Cool. This is great. All right. Thanks, Adam. This was fun.
Thanks, John.
All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to that conversation with Adam Nathan from Almanac. Hopefully you found that insightful. I definitely did. Reminder, we drop new episodes of the Leadmore podcast every single Thursday. We're getting close to 70 episodes. And I'm so grateful for you for listening to the show. So if you do listen, go ahead and subscribe on Apple, click follow. If you listen on Spotify, that helps tell other people about our show and helps it make it easier to be found. Very, very helpful to us. So thank you so much. And as always, as I close, take care and be well.